You don't work for us anymore, right? Right.
Oh, hi, Teresa.
Good afternoon, everyone. It's great to see everybody.
Yeah, it's so great for to see folks, and I can't see this list. I always feel like Teams is always tricking me. Let me see if I can get the list. Um, who are we waiting for? It's Commissioner McFadden. Are you here? Oh, there you are. Okay. Yes. And is Chechnya here? Let's see.
I don't see her.
Okay, so we'll it's right on the time, so we'll give a few seconds. But hi, Ronald, how are you doing, Commissioner McFadden? Is your hair colored red now? Is that what I'm seeing?
Good afternoon, Dr. Brooks. You are not seeing red hair.
Oh, really?
Because there's something organically wrong with it?
No, nothing.
Oh.
You may soon see a commissioner, a new commissioner with red hair. Maybe not bright red, but kind of red. Chief Perkins Cohen, your background looks lovely.
Thank you. I took him. I was at the office like Josh, but then I left before this meeting so I could be on my porch. But it is nice.
Yeah, it is nice.
It is. I hope we all get to be out in nature and see those beautiful trees and green. Well, then how about we just go ahead and get started, and hopefully Chechnya will join us later. So I just wanted to sort of kick off this meeting of our May 18th policy committee meeting. Today, we will be sort of discussing our policy LCA, which is around data sharing and policy GBEG around nepotism. And really want to just sort of open the floor up to the folks who are going to be presenting on the data. And before that, just to remind our presenters, if we could make the presentations 20 minutes so that we could have a robust time for conversation. And with that being said, I'm going to pass it over. I'm assuming is it to you, Chief Sivan? No, probably.
It's actually coming over to me. So I'll go ahead and jump in with a very brief introduction because I know our time is tight and we have a lot to cover with this policy. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Teresa Jones and I serve the district as the Chief Achievement and Accountability Officer. With me, I have Dr. Christopher Wan, who is our Director of Research Services, and other members of our Research Services team. This afternoon, we are going to share with you our work in progress around revising this particular policy around how we conduct research and surveys, as well as data sharing. I also want to acknowledge up front the very close collaboration that we've had with our legal office. They have been invaluable partners with us as we have not only started this work around the policy revisions, but also just thinking about how we share data, how we present it, how we can sort of strike the balance that you hear us talk about between meeting the needs that individuals have about access to data and balancing the needs of privacy for whose data we are good stewards for. So with that, I am going to turn it over to Dr. Wan.
Thank you, Teresa. So again, I'm Chris Wan. I'm the Director of Research and work in the Office of Achievement and Accountability with Teresa and the research team. So we're here today to discuss policy LCA, which is our policy on data sharing, research, and conducting surveys in city schools. It's a very broad policy, and it touches on a lot of the work that the Office of Achievement and Accountability, as well as IT and other offices do to share and exchange data both internally and externally with partners. The policy defines key terms and sets standards for how we authorize research studies to take place in city school. And the review process through our Institutional Review Board, our IRB, to examine those research studies and make sure all the components are in place to keep our students safe. It also defines standards for sharing data with external partners and internal partners. So how are we allowed to share things such as student records, test scores, staff data, pretty much anything that City Schools gathers in its ordinary business and would publish on the website or share external. It also sets standards for how we create data sharing contracts. So our memorandums of understanding and our professional service agreements. These are legal contracts with partners that define how we share data, how it should be used, and followed up if in case there's any event such as a data breach or other problems with the arrangement. It also governs the consent process. So how we ask families, students, and staff to participate in research and how they get informed consent so that they're aware of what study they're signing up for and what it'll involve, and then be able to be transparent and agreeing to participate. And finally, the policy touches on how we share data publicly. So when we display data on our website, in other board presentations, or in our regular business, it speaks to how we have to share that data and how we have to, what we can and cannot reveal publicly. The policy is really heavily informed by a law I'm sure many of us are familiar with, which is FERPA, the Family Educational Rights and Privacy Act, as well as other laws and acts such as the Maryland Public Information Act, which governs the public's access to public records and the records of the school system. And we also rely heavily on some of the Code of Federal Regulations, particularly the sections on the protection of human subjects in research studies, and the sections on institutional review boards and how we review research proposals to the district. The image on the right is that of a balanced scale, and that is kind of the mascot for this policy. LCA is a balancing act. We have to weigh different things, such as our need to be transparent with the public and share data. We have to weigh that against the student's right and our staff's right to privacy, to keep their information safe and out of public view. So we have to find a delicate balance between those 2 points. Also, when considering research studies, we have to look at the potential risks they could cause to our participants, such as time loss from educational activities or instruction, alongside with the benefits. So what is the potential advantage for participating in a study? It could bring, in many cases, additional resources or staffing into city schools. And we have to weigh those very carefully as we engage in this work. So you can go to the next slide, Joe. So the policy was originally created in 2016. So we're up on 5 years after it was created. And to assess our need for revisions, we really started close to home, and that is with the Office of Achievement and Accountability and our teams within that office. OAA has processed hundreds, if not thousands, of data requests since the policy was created. So we've gotten a lot of experience hands-on with sharing data with partners. We've also reviewed research proposals that are intended to take place in the school system. We do that every month through our review board, our IRB. And we've also created a data governance work group, which crosses across multiple offices that handles issues of practice that come up in data sharing, such as reviewing MOUs or agreements as a group and getting feedback, not just from OAA, but from other offices that might have a part in the work. We've really gotten a lot of feedback from that data governance work group. It's been a very useful or a tool to have in city schools since it's across many offices and we get feedback from all over North Avenue about data sharing. We've also gotten a lot of feedback, again, in our practice. So as we've processed requests and with follow-up conversations with researchers and data requesters, we've learned a lot about where some of the strengths of our policy are and some of the weaknesses. Finally, we've recently embarked on a series of stakeholder engagement sessions, which I'll detail more at the end of the presentation, to get feedback from some of our additional stakeholders, such as parents and students and other groups. Lastly, to assess our need for revisions, we also combed the websites of a lot of different other large urban public school districts. We have a number of them on the right. And we took a look at what does our policy have in it that theirs doesn't, and vice versa. Are there things that we see other school systems doing, that we would like to bring into our own policy? So in a way, we did a gap analysis between us and some of our large urban partners. Next slide. Where we netted out in our review for revisions is we kind of came up with 3 main buckets to target with revisions to the policy. First one is setting some new standards and priorities for our IRB, our Institutional Review Board. That is the group within city schools that reviews potential research studies that take place and either approves or declines them based on value to the district, methodology, and other considerations. So first bucket there, updating some of our IRB standards. Second bucket is we wanted to clarify data sharing procedures across city schools. Some of the feedback we've gotten over the years is that this can be very confusing, both internally and externally with partners. It can be tough for folks to figure out exactly what steps they need to take to make sure they're sharing data in a secure and safe manner. Finally, the last bucket is we'd like to update some of our data suppression rules. Data suppression is an activity we engage in to help prevent disclosure of student privacy in some of our public reporting. And we'll talk in more detail about each of these as we get through the presentation. So next slide, please, Jim. Our first set of revisions around IRB, I'll really break them down into 4 categories. First, we would like to update the policy to clarify our consent standard. We want to make sure that all research studies taking place in the district require active consent or opt-in consent versus passive consent, which is opt-out consent. So for opt-in or active consent to participate, a student will need to produce a form with their parent guardian signature saying they can participate. Some studies in the past have utilized opt-out consent, which they'll send home a form, and if the student doesn't bring it back signed, they're automatically included in a study or survey. That doesn't go far enough to make sure that our students and families know about their participation. If someone leaves that form at home or doesn't bring it back, the message could not get delivered. I want to make sure that folks are clear when they're participating by requiring that active consent. Second, we want to look at equity in our research process. We've noticed over the years that lots of studies can tend to exclude certain student groups, often for valid reasons on a case-by-case basis, but in aggregate, it can lead to some students not having the same opportunities to participate in research that all other students do. Notice that particularly with our English learners. A lot of research studies that are proposed to the district cite additional costs for translation, activities that would make it them unavailable to recruit EL students to participate. That's something we'd like to work with our equity team over the next coming months to come up with ways we could possibly ask additional questions or come up with a procedure for making sure all those students have access to participation in research and they aren't being excluded disproportionately more than other groups. Our third bucket, we'd like to set a remuneration limit. So often research studies will pay a small stipend for folks to participate. We don't currently have guidance other than, if anybody is concerned, they should go to the Board of Ethics for City Schools to ask questions or have that case reviewed. We'd like to set a limit at $50 for individuals per study so that we have a kind of a guide mark for when remuneration becomes too excessive. So if research studies start, offering large amounts of money for participation, that can start to become coercive for participants and might induce them to participate in something that they might, not otherwise be comfortable doing because the money they're being offered is so high. So that's something we have to keep a careful eye on. Finally, the fourth point around our revisions to IRB would be about research sponsorship. We'd really like to start implementing a research sponsorship model that we've seen done in other places, such as Boston. I think Montgomery County in Maryland also does this. And it's also a model we've implemented in our partnership with the Baltimore Education Research Consortium, which is a group of universities, city schools regularly interfaces with to conduct research projects. In short, a research sponsor would be a person at the central office in a leadership role who would agree to be part of a research study as a sponsor. They would be responsible for reviewing the proposal, making sure that as the researchers conduct their work, any findings are taken back to the appropriate content team. And ideally, that person should be in a role that relates very well to the research. So if it's a math study on instruction, we would want someone sponsoring that from our math department. So in summary, these are the revisions we're making to our IRB. And we will move on to the second one. So if you can click next slide, which is to improve clarity of our data sharing process. So we've reflected in OAA in our data governance work group Again, that there's been a lot of confusion over the years, difficulty getting some of our data sharing agreements in place and making sense of a rather broad and complex policy that we have. So we've gone through our policy and tried to improve the language, eliminate some redundancies, and hopefully clarify some of the rules and standards we have in place for data sharing. We particularly want to clarify some of the different types of data requests we receive, such as those from MPIA requests or those that might come from vendors. Those can be often different than requests we'll get from external researchers. That could involve actually a participatory element in recruiting students to participate in a study. Some key changes we're making is we're going to start to require the Chief Achievement and Accountability Officer, along with OAA and our Data Governance Work Group, to review all MOUs or contracts that involve data sharing prior to their final signature and execution. So we can just make sure that we're not entering in any written agreements with folks without a very thorough vetting process for what data is being shared with that individual or external party. We're also going to allow sharing of de-identified individual farms, which is free or reduced lunch information, or direct certification data with researchers. This is a very important covariate for a lot of researchers and can be interested in many research studies. They want to know, different levels of poverty among our students in schools, so they can help account for that when doing program evaluations and other activities. In our previous policy, we barred sharing from this at all, and received a lot of feedback from our research partners that was very restrictive and could interfere with some of their planned research activities. Finally, we've included a lot more in-depth information about what PII is, or personally identifiable information, and additional language around data security and standards for making sure that when we share student data, it's being kept safely by that external party. So our second set of revisions, improved clarity of data sharing process. And we'll move on to the last major bucket, which is our updated data suppression rules. So under FERPA, all educational agencies, both the local school systems like us and state and federal agencies, are charged with protecting privacy of student records. So that, we require consent when student records are released, but we also release student records often in aggregate through our website, through spreadsheets or data files that we'll post there. Our current rules in the policy says that city schools will apply data suppression of school or district level data if the number of students in the aggregated group could lead to identification of a single student. In most cases, that means groups of 9 or less are suppressed. So if we're showing very small cuts of data, with very small sizes, sometimes you could see that only 1 or 2 students in a group were perhaps proficient on PARCC or had perfect attendance or another measure. Once you get to those really small sizes of groups, it can be possible to identify who that student is based on other information we might be displaying publicly. So we suppress the data, which I'll show you in a second, to make sure that you can't understand who that student is, and that even in our aggregate reports, our student privacy is protected. To do this, we've looked at our neighbors in Montgomery County, the Maryland State Department of Education, and also referred heavily from a standard from the Department of Education, which is sort of the gold standard on how to perform data suppression with educational data. Go to the next slide. In our review, we found that city schools sits on kind of the less restrictive and therefore higher disclosure risk side of the spectrum. Some of our other partners are a little more restrictive and have better protections in place to lower risk of inadvertent disclosure. We'd like to move our policy in that direction. You see us all the way on the left. We basically will suppress or not show data when a group size is less than 10. Some of our other partners start to insert additional rules, and we'd like to bring ourselves in line more with Montgomery County in how they suppress their data to protect against inadvertent disclosure. So you can go to the next slide. To give you an idea of what we're talking about here and what data suppression looks like, got two of our biggest rules that we're going to implement on the left, and then an example from our park file, which is on the website, showing what the rules looks like when they've been applied. If we have a group that's less than 10, we will not show outcomes associated with that data. So you can see on the image in the right, we have like the race groups, American Indian, as well as their Asian student groups in this example. They have a sample size less than 10, and we're putting asterisks, or we're gonna, redacting the set of data associated with that small group so that you can't end up identifying individual students in an aggregate report. When the sample size is less than or equal to 20, we won't show the exact sample size. We'll write it as less than or equal to 20. And but in that case, we will show our outcomes. So you can see that for our English learner group, yes, we have less than or equal to 20 shown as the number in the group, but then we showed some of their data on the right. Finally, if a group size is above 20, we don't suppress it at all. You can see some examples in that, such as with our Black student group with 379 students. We don't suppress or redact any information there. Finally, an additional step that we need to take is if we have very high or low proportions or percentages in the data we're displaying, we often need to mask those or blur them so that you can't tell an exact proportion is either 100 or 0. If you think about it, we have a public data file that says 100% of students at school X passed the test. Well, actually, in a way, that becomes a disclosure of student data, because now I know if you went to this school, you must have passed the test. So I, in effect, know that you individually have passed that test. So this is something we do to protect that. We always want to leave a little bit of uncertainty that'll prevent students from being their records from being identified in our public reports. Go to the next slide. Finally, this is the last slide in the presentation. I wanted to talk a little bit about the engagement work we have planned. So as I mentioned, we've drawn heavily on OAA's experience in the data governance work group. We've also met with a number of partners already and have some meetings planned for further discussion upcoming. We've met extensively with our partners at BERC, Baltimore Education Research Consortium. That's a large group of external researchers that have provided feedback on our data suppression rules and some of our planned IRB revisions. Again, also I've met extensively with our internal data governance work group. And then we've started to recently meet with some of our other groups, just met with our Special Education Citizens Advisory Committee last week. And we have meetings planned with additional groups, PCAB, our Charter Advisory Board, and ASCBC coming up later this month. So that concludes the overview of our planned revisions. And I'm happy to take questions.
Awesome. Thank you so much for the presentation.
Sure.
One second, I'm getting. Dismiss that. Okay. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So first, again, thank you all so much for the wonderful presentation. We'll love to open it up for our board members, to our policy committee members to ask some questions. Is it okay if we started with Dr. James, if you had any questions?
Sure. Thank you. So thank you, Chris, for the presentation. And now I'm getting an echo. Is there anything I can do on this end on that? Maybe it's
my camera and then it.
Okay, it sounds like it's gone. Yeah, okay. All right. If it comes back, I'll stop it. It's very annoying. So first question is, does this apply only to student data, or does it apply to operational systematic data as well? Like how many buses, what bus routes, how much potable water, that kind of thing. So that's my first question. I don't know if you want to address that, and then I'll.
Yep. So yeah, this policy actually pretty much covers all data that's generated by the school system. So that would include student data and student records, staff or personnel data, as well as like facilities or other data that could come up in practice that's not associated with an individual.
Okay, and that was my assumption from reading the policy, but from the presentation, I just want to make sure, especially the public would know that that we're not hiding those pieces, that we do share that information as necessary.
Yep.
And then I love how you are working, and we did this in the last policy iteration of this. I'm not sure if you were around, Chris, to make data more accessible for folks. One of the things that I've seen on the street, though, in working with master's programs and doctoral programs around the city at different universities, is a lot of times, especially master's students, are not aware that they need to get IRB approval, especially on their own classroom data and things like that. And it can be quite cumbersome for your office to have to deal with, there's what, 1,000 master's students a year coming through places.
Yeah.
So wondering if there's not an opportunity to use this policy to develop a partnership with either Burke or a cadre of colleagues who are at the master's granting institutions that could review IRBs as undergraduate student research or graduate student research on behalf of city schools to help someone walk through that process. So as we encourage more undergraduate student research, as we start to encourage more high school student research, we can make sure that we're dotting I's, crossing T's, and everyone's researching within the best interest of our young people, but also not overburdening your office with it. And even down then to the granular level of teachers are expected to complete SLOs, which is research being collected data on their students, but they're not going through the IRB process. So how are we, so is it about using this policy to create an opportunity to disperse the responsibility of saying, what is equitable, what's appropriate, what's ethical, as a way to move forward with increasing the legitimacy of SLOs, the investment and the interest of master's students and undergraduate student level research within city schools. And it's a little different at the doctoral level, because I think there's more adherence to that. Although I've been in conversation with several doctoral faculty around the state at various institutions who are like, oh, really? My candidate's a teacher in that school, so they're just collecting this data, and like, yeah. Not okay. So just looking to how we can use this policy as an opportunity to either create a more informed body around what research looks like, as well as to really encourage inquiry and investigation, because that's how we all grow. So I don't know if you have any ideas or suggestions or thoughts along those lines. And then that's all my comments, Mr. Chair.
Yeah, so there's a lot of excellent points. I in a lot of ways, these are some of the things, we've actually been discussing in our Burke Research Board. So even in the past month, we've met several times around this policy and some of the ways we can engage on some of these topics. So, one thing you brought up is the research of graduate students. Really, within the past several years, the number of graduate student proposals we've received in city schools has really increased. And I think that has to do a lot with, the emergence of online PhD and master's programs. We start, seeing a lot of proposals come from all over the country. Often those individuals aren't associated with Baltimore. They might be casting a very wide net for a research study. And it can actually become very cumbersome to have to read through all those proposals and take a lot of the time of our staff. What we've been talking about with Burke, and a lot of this has led us to think about that research sponsorship model and that change that we mentioned in the revisions. We want to make sure that if a study is coming in from a graduate student, it's been reviewed by their advisor at their university. They're aware of the submission. They've gone through and made sure the methodology is described well and is sound. Because often we'll get those that don't often look like they might have been read through by the advisor, and then we have to say, well, you need to go back and work on this a little bit. So that's one thing. And also making sure that, graduate students have a connection to our students and staff. So, we don't want to just use our schools as a lab and have our kids sign up for research studies, for coming from all over the country. We want the results of those studies to be meaningful and the participation of our students to be meaningful. So, want to make sure that if someone's going to do a study, they have a point person in the district, a sponsor they can share those findings with. Work through any issues that come up and help city schools interpret the data. So we've really been looking at, still working in our conversations with Burke and other partners about how we can take that sponsorship model and help it to do some of the things I think you're suggesting. Another point you brought up is, and this is again, working on that clarity of data sharing. So for example, SLOs are actually considered internal research activity, and they don't require, an MOU or an IRB submission. Generally, if someone works for city schools and they're performing a research activity or data analysis activity as part of their job duties, so in this case, our teachers need to do their SLOs, that is considered internal research. We don't have to have, an IRB review or any kind of contractual arrangement with that person. That's just part of doing their job. If that same individual then goes, I really like my SLO, I want to make it into my master's thesis, that then becomes considered external research. That's not, earning a master's degree. While we definitely encourage that among our staff, it's not really part of their job duties per se. In which case, if they go that direction, they want to work on a doctoral master's thesis, that's when they need to go through IRB. And I think a lot of what we're doing working with Burke is trying to make sure folks understand, hey, you need to submit these for IRBs. We need to, work as part of this policy on some of our training to make sure our staff, we're informing them from our end as well. But again, you touched on a lot of good points that we've been discussing over the few months, and hopefully some of these revisions, especially that district sponsorship one, will help to improve the quality and interpretation of research that's going on in city schools.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you. Commissioner McFadden, do you have any questions, comments?
Thank you. And thanks to the team. With what you just were talking about teachers perhaps doing some work outside of their work. So if it's for a degree program or something externally, how do we intend to communicate the IRB process to them so that they understand that this is not like an SLO or something that they're doing internally, but if they're working on something externally, how do we communicate that to them? And then how do we, because in the regulation draft, I saw that in any requests can't come directly to the school. There's a process. So how are we, to your point that you were just making, training and preparing principals to handle inquiries like that, so that all of that is clear, so that there's no breach in or any type of violation? I hope that that's making sense, what I'm asking.
Yep, absolutely. I mean, I think in a lot of ways that was really, some of the centralizing this process and making sure we were consistent in how we were sharing data was really what led us, to the initial policy in 2016. So recently in the data governance work group that I mentioned, that was started by our office and has now, got membership from all over different offices in North Avenue. We've actually just started embarking on a process of reviewing what existing training materials we have. So we developed some when the policy was originally created in 2016. We're taking a look at those, and we're finding where there are gaps or where we can, create new materials and get those out to individuals so they can be aware of some of the requirements of IRB and data sharing agreements and things like that. So that's a process which really gotten underway in our data governance work group. I also think, it begins in part with conversations like this and actually revising the policy, making sure that, folks are aware the language is easy to read and understand. And then we'll need to develop training materials to get that word out. It helps to, work both internally, on our end in city schools, but also I meet every week with our partners at Burke. So a lot of, universities and graduate programs are represented there, and we're sure to emphasize that message. They've all, been reviewing this policy. So hopefully not only can we tackle this kind of internally, but if we meet with some of our, our schools that we have a lot of students from, like Hopkins, Morgan State, and other ones in the city and state of Maryland, kind of doing messaging on both sides. Hopefully we can, make sure that folks are aware of the requirements of the process. That's always been a challenge to make sure folks know about that. But I think it's gotten better, at least since the beginning of 2016 when we started this policy. We have, have a lot less incidents or things we hear about where someone didn't know, you know, about an IRB requirement or something like that. So we still have work to do there, but I think we've come a long way already.
So what do we do when we find that information has been used inappropriately or not gone through the process? What do we do in response to that? For example, if someone is using data and they haven't gone through this particular process, is there something that happens to rectify that?
Yeah, so in some cases, like if it's a data breach, we will recall the data. Like I can ask the person to destroy it and then make them go through the appropriate processes so that, you know, they can obtain, you know, the correct verification. A lot of that depends on the incident, the nature of the incident, what was shared. Anyone who, you know, it does a research study with Baltimore City Schools. We have a system, an IRB manager system, that if any data is misplaced or lost, they have to report that within 24 hours. That's also true of all of our vendor contracts and relationships. So it varies depending on the situation, but often we can require that the data be, you know, deleted, and that, you know, we make sure we review the request. But again, that has not been something that's been commonplace recently.
And then finally, I'm interested in knowing what some of the stakeholder groups that you've already reached out to and chatted with. I'm curious to know how they responded to the information that you gave to them. I'm not sure if it was like a discussion or a meeting or maybe focus group type setting, or if they just received the presentation. I'm curious to know what were some of their thoughts? What were some of their ideas? What came out of those particular? I know that you're meeting with members of PCAB and the operator-led schools, well, the advisory board and ASCBC, but you mentioned a few other groups. So I'm just interested to hear what some of that discussion was.
Yeah, you know, I think a lot of our stakeholders, you know, this isn't something that they think about in the context of the school system a lot, that we have research studies taking place. So there's often a lot of interest from some of these groups in just, you know, understanding what is taking place in city schools, what types of projects we prioritize, and how we review those things. We've also heard a lot about, you know, even from stakeholders within the same group sometimes, like, you know, that balancing act, that scale about, you know, both the need for transparency and sharing our data, but also like from parents and others, the need that they really want their student data kept private and the harm that could potentially cause as it's disclosed. So I think a lot of people kind of recognize some of the challenges that we have. They understand that data sharing can, you know, do a lot of good for the school system, but it also carries with it risks and you know, can, you know, be invasive to classroom time. To participate in research studies and things like that. So, you know, that's kind of, again, you know, we're at the beginning of that feedback cycle, meeting with a lot of groups towards the end of May and June. So I'm interested to hear what some of these other folks say, but that's kind of the gist of what we heard so far. Just kind of a realization that research is taking place in city schools and an appreciation of kind of finding that balance between some of these kind of opposing forces.
Thanks. Thank you.
Sure.
Great. Chair Chinia, did you have any questions or comments?
Yeah, my comment is really around the sorry, I'm getting the echo. My comment is really around the last point that you were just doing in terms of the need to really design either some way of training or communication to parents in terms of what the research is all about, this whole issue of opting in versus opting out. I think that's going to be an important thing for them to be aware of. So you talked a little bit about it, but that whole piece of communicating, and I know we sent a lot of information out beginning of the year with the handbook, but I think we need to do a little bit more than that in this case.
Yeah, I agree. And there's other opportunities for us to get the word out. You know, the parents also sign a form about consenting to directory information release to students. So we do have some chances we can take a look at those materials and see if, like, you know, one, we need to incorporate any revisions into those, but also make sure that we're, communicating it in a transparent way that families can understand. So I completely agree. Yeah.
Thanks. That was my question. Thank you.
Sure.
Awesome. And I have a few questions. So I guess, let's see, where do I want to start? So I was looking at the compliance report from last year, and was curious about data breaches and sort of how and where and which way are they sort of reported in that compliance report. How would we know, right, if there was something there? Because I didn't see anything listed in the compliance report from last year.
Yes, I don't know that we had any, but we would have to check and make sure that that is a component in the compliance report, and that's definitely something we could incorporate in those when we do them August, September going forward. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, because I think attached to that for me is then if we're supposed to use our compliance reports to really sort of inform how we sort of make decisions about change, whether or not something is strong enough or reporting in the right ways. So for example, in addition to that, sort of where are we sort of collecting serious adverse incidents, for example, within our research? Are we allowing the researchers who are doing that to collect it through their IRB, or are we collecting that information as well, given that those could be sort of breaches that could not only jeopardize the risk of the participants, our students, but also their families? So are we collecting that data around serious adverse events?
Yes, we are. And we do that through a system called IRB Manager. So when someone, receives an approval to engage in research, and they've, been reviewed by IRB and they're good to go, they maintain an account in that system. If at any time during the course of a research study, there's any type of adverse event, such as loss of data or identification of a student or something in a way that wasn't supposed to happen in the normal course of a research study, that individual, that researcher is required to report that to us through IRB Manager systems. They can go in there and often will log it in that. It'll notify us. They often will also call or email our office when that occurs. And so they'll do that with the city schools IRB, but then typically a lot of these projects will also have kind of dual review by an institutional IRB. So if the researcher is at a college or university, they will also report to that entity as well. So we do monitor that from city school side, but also from the underlying university or institution as well.
Great. And so is there any reason why that doesn't live in the compliance report?
Yeah, I don't know that that's something we typically reported in the compliance report, but we can certainly incorporate that into future versions. Yeah.
Great, because I think sort of so for me, like that is supposed to help us understand where there are breaches in our system, and if we're not capturing in our compliance reports serious adverse incidents that we don't know how many of our students are actually being potentially exposed, and we as a board can't then determine where we might need to change or shift in order to shore up our system. So for me, that feels like it would be an important compliance sort of report out. So when we get it, that would be something that we would be looking for in our work.
Yeah, and the adverse events can vary a lot, from very, very minor. And I guess I don't know that we've had any I would consider like serious adverse events. There's been a couple of situations where someone's like misplaced a briefcase or something during the course of a study. And but for the most part, those can range, very much from very, very minor things, which are typically the ones we see, to more serious ones.
Yeah, I think that would be helpful just for us as a board to sort of be aware of when we're doing the work. And deviations, I'm assuming, might just be a little bit more granular and too specific to report here. And it might be on the research side. But, for us, we were tracking both sort of serious adverse incidents and as well as deviations, because deviations need to be reported to the IRB as well. So just kind of wanted to sort of name that. I had another sort of question around sort of, given that this is policy is around all the data that we collect, is it the assumption that all of our compliance informing institutions, like our policies around FERPA, for example, that HIPAA is also included or subsumed in that as well?
Yes, where that applies, we do follow HIPAA regulations as well.
Okay, is there a reason why I didn't see it in the policy? Was it
in the applicable law section?
Yeah.
Okay.
It's noted under the definitions on page 1 for applicable law. HIPAA is listed in that
Okay.
section.
Okay. Yeah, because I didn't see it in there, so I must have just missed that. Okay, great. And so do we have any differentiation between, so I know that, for example, under our students who in research projects for, I believe it's Title IX, our teen pregnancy prevention and all those things, some of those types of studies don't necessarily require parental consent. Is there any way in which we're sort of like capturing that information, particularly as it relates to sexual and reproductive health? Because some of those services wouldn't necessarily require the assent or the consent of a parent to opt in. So how are we addressing that, for example, in this policy?
Yeah, so I don't know that we have studies of that nature. We do some work with some health clinics in certain charter and other schools in the district. So yeah, I don't know that that's something that we've typically encountered. But you know, what we do go through is anytime we're about to enter into a research study or expose our students to participation in a research study, we generally will require an agreement, a legal contract to be written up that explains the data sharing or any relationship, anything that's going to be collected from students. And that undergoes review both by our office as well as our legal office, so we can make sure that all these different laws and acts are being upheld and followed before that work gets underway.
Great. And I guess sort of what I'm trying to differentiate, which I think would also be helpful for the compliance report, is the types of studies that we actually get and that we sort of allow in the system and the ones that we don't, which I also feel like is attached to an equity issue. So for example, if wholeness is something that we're committed to, the fact that we don't have any sexual and reproductive health studies sort of in this pool alarms me, given that we know that those particular things have an impact on educational outcomes. And so for me, so I'm trying to get a bigger sense around sort of, so one, to name that, but then two, do we actually have a progressive research agenda to advance the holistic needs of our students? And how are we leveraging research, particular research opportunities to address those holistic aspects of that we know that teen pregnancy is a thing here that impacts so many of our students, or sexual reproductive health, HIV, STIs, all of that is linked to educational outcomes. So I would love to hear some of your thinking, or if you're working with this research group, how is that being sort of considered in the context of this this policy?
Yeah, so what we've recognized is really a need for a district sponsor for a lot of these research studies. So in many cases, when we've received new research studies that have a wholeness focus, we'll meet with Sarah Warren and her team. I've discussed a lot of those over time with her. Again, it's a balancing act because there's a lot one could want to research about our students. Some of the sexual reproductive issues you mentioned, but also things like more straightforward in the realm of educational research, like curriculum interventions or tutoring evaluations and things of that nature. So we really rely on and want to strengthen, like when we get a research proposal, want to talk that through with the relevant content office and make sure this is something that the district wants to prioritize. In a way, we can't say yes to every research study, every research topic that comes to the school system. Want to make sure that it's going to be a valuable research effort. And the way we do that is really to connect with some of those content offices, understand what they need, what projects they're working on. A lot of times, being in OAA, we'll have a lot of visibility to that because the content offices will make data requests for us. So we'll realize, what they're working on or what they need, and also have a lot of conversations about that with our partners in North Avenue. So that's been really the primary way we've done that. Again, hoping some of these revisions, the role of a district sponsor, will help make sure like we're not having any gaps in what's going on in city schools. But we have to trust our experts, in those different areas.
Great. And so I think for me, what feels important then is to be tracking the types of projects that we actually both let in, but then we also reject. So who's holding the balance between what's coming in for curriculum, what's coming in for sort of more wholeness and traditional measures, what's coming in for sexual and reproductive health measures, for example. Sort of what does the pie look like and sort of how it's being divided. And that for me feels important to see where there might be imbalances around who's getting access to our students and what type of work versus ones that are not getting access. And I just have one more question, particular to, you said that there's a research group that you meet with, I believe it was Burke, is that what you were?
Yep.
And so how is the community actually driving the research agenda in Burke?
Yeah, so Burke is a partnership of basically all the different universities in the state of Maryland, and each one of them has an institutional lead. We meet on a monthly basis, and then myself, a representative from Morgan and Hopkins, the original members of Burke, meet on a weekly basis. So a lot of that work with Burke is it's kind of balancing. We get a lot of ideas from professors and other folks at the university. So they're representing their own research interests, but also they partner with community organizations and they'll come up with research projects on their own. They can then bring those to the research board, and that'll kind of get us in touch with the researchers. And we can work, from that group, I can kind of interface researchers at universities with our internal staff to make sure like, hey, we want to do this project on community schools. We have this idea. But, let's come to Burke. Let's now have you guys go talk to some of our community school coordinators or our engagement office and see, you had this original idea, but the engagement office, really has, this other thing they would like to have investigated as part of the research. So it's kind of a negotiation process that we do with that group, trying to balance like the desire of the researcher, but also making sure that, we do have an opportunity to vet that internally and hear from some of our other stakeholders as well.
Great. So I think I asked that because what feels important is that we know that researchers have their own agendas and that sometimes that those are not in alignment with community needs and wants and recommendations. And so what feels important for me in this particular policy is thinking deeply about how we go from get community desire around things that matter to them, and then how do we align those with potential research opportunities, and not to sort of say, have me, for example, say, I want to do this thing, let me go and find a community organization who can co-sign on it to do this work. Because I think those are two different ways, because I can still be the generator and the genesis. And just because I have a community-based organization, I have their letter of support, doesn't actually mean that that's the actual will of the community. And so I think from me and my perspective, like this feels important to be thinking about how we generate those ideas around what students and families need in Baltimore City, and then create an agenda and say, hey, who can help us lift up the needs of our parents and our students that they feel important as a part of research. And so I'll pause there and let other commissioners weigh in if they had any thoughts or additional questions.
What are some, if you could think about some suggestions or ideas to see that conceptualized? What could be some recommendations to staff in supporting that type of community engagement around the data gathering, sharing, and all of that?
I think sort of one of the ways that, I think if we were to use an existing structure, the way in which communications and Dr. Chief Highcovert's work is sort of rolling out around the recovery, right? So we would just be asking community members what feels important for advancing a particular research agenda, and sort of, again, have it to be generated from their needs and their wants, and then sort of roll up to the Burke and say, hey, we've done we've gotten feedback from 150 families or 2,000 families around something that they feel is important. Can we then sort of think about how we partner folks who are working in research that already have an interest in here to then partner in collaboration to elevate that research? Partly because one of the things that happens if you're in the institution long enough, folks with the on the tenure track with more experience get greater access and opportunity to resources. And so community participatory research is not something that is really valued in a lot of these institutions. And so we miss things because the folks who are actually about the community won't ever get the money in order to actually do those community engaged research projects. And yet they go to these larger institutions, and then it's the bigwigs that continue to bring in the research and drive it. And so I think in alignment with sort of my values around sort of community first, helping researchers who already have an interest in elevating the students and families of Baltimore to work with our students and families of Baltimore to do research feels, one, important, but then also different from how things are currently operating in the city.
I think that can also relate to educating our community on why this entire process is important. So I appreciate that. I just wanted to gain a little bit more insight in your perspective around that. I appreciate that.
Commissioner
If I could add, no, I just, that echoes what I was trying to say about master's students and undergraduate research and high school research, ensuring that those researchers that don't have the R1 backing behind them or the large foundation funding backing behind them are still able to engage in, because I mean, our even like our ingenuity students who are doing data collection on our schools, do they understand these filters? And are these filters there as a barrier or to protect, or are they there as a barrier to eliminate the dissemination of information? And so I think that's right along exactly what I was saying. I was just targeting more towards masters in high school. So I really appreciate the community aspect being highlighted. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And, you know, I think sort of one other thing for me, the compliance report, I would love to hear where, like, once those folks have been, we've accepted their research, where the racial and demographic breakdowns of the researchers, the primary leads of that, to make sure that they're equitable, and then also where they're coming from in terms of their universities, to ensure that our HBCUs, I hear that they're part of the founding of the Berk, but that we have representation from our HBCUs, and I'm not sure how much research happens at the community college level, but we have access to that as well, that they have access rather to our process. And so I think that would live in a compliance report as well.
Yeah, sure. And that's, one of the goals we want to work with our equity team on. We currently don't, even ask a question in the IRB application. What is the racial identity of the researcher proposing the project? We do have the university they're coming from in there, but we need to take a look at some of the ways we're collecting data on some of those things, so that way we would be able to put that in a compliance report. But this is exactly, we've had this conversation before on our team. It's something we really want to look into, because large urban school districts are in large cities, and they're often targets for a lot of research projects. And it's like, we don't want our kids to be experimented on. We want to make sure we're engaging in research that's valuable, that's going to help them in their education and development. So we want to make sure, we have an equitable process.
Great. Any final words? Chair Chinia, did you have any last words or thoughts? Okay. Oh, you're on mute, Chair Chinia.
Sorry, I'm having some technical problems, so I had to turn the camera off. But no, I think you've covered a lot. I almost see two tracks in terms of the initial piece that sounded like just having some understanding of how research is done, and another track that's then looking at how we might solicit and encourage certain kinds of research. So, yeah.
Yeah, Thank you for that. And thank you, Dr. Wan, and thank you, Chief Jones, for a wonderful presentation. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Have a good one.
Thanks. And next up, we'll have our policy, what is it? Back to my agenda, where did it go? The nepotism policy, which is, I don't know who's presenting on that one, but I will pass it over.
Jerome Jones, Director of Labor Relations and Negotiations. I'm presenting on this.
Awesome. Welcome.
Yes, good afternoon all. Commissioners, a glorious day outside. So we want to, I'm presenting on a nepotism policy. The policy defines the family members, immediate family members, what we mean by that. And it provides guidance to employees with regard to hiring, transfer, promotion, supervision, discipline, and evaluation of immediate family members. Okay. So it defines nepotism as favoritism to an immediate family member with regard to employment. I am not going to read the second bullet, but you see how far-reaching the policy goes in defining immediate family. And that's going to be the biggest change we do here. Next. And these are all the things that the policy addresses: discrimination. It applies to full and part-time, all full-time, part-time, and temporary employees. The members of immediate family, prohibits family members from hiring, promoting, evaluating, supervising. Currently, it prohibits immediate family members from working in the same school, office, or administrative unit. And if board members enter into a relationship that violates this policy, one of the employees will be transferred, and board members and employees may not vote or take action involving the employment, assignment, promotion, compensation, discipline of immediate family members. So here's the big change. There are two big changes here that we want to make to the policy, and that's to really narrow down the definition of immediate family members as it applies to this policy, to include just spouse, brother, sister, parents, children, and anyone that the employee is involved in a sexual or romantic relationship. The last one is not included in the current iteration of the policy, but we felt we needed to add that. Also, we are removing the prohibition of two family members working in the same school, office, administrative unit, as long as one does not hire, transfer, supervise, evaluate, or discipline family members. We're recommending this change because over the years we've seen we've seen family members working in the same school, maybe two teachers working in the same school, and what happens is, of course, there is a greater school community, and because of the policy, we've had to move employees out of a school that they may have been in for a long time, and it has not better served students in doing that. And as long as one is not supervising another, it is, I think, something that we've learned over the years, that we should really focus the nepotism policy on addressing where one family member actually evaluates or has a say in the employment of another family member. So those are the two big changes that we're recommending for the nepotism policy. Next. And in the accompanying regulation, we are looking at the responsibility to report immediate family members employed by the board. It is the applicant's responsibility now. It's not ours to go out and find this. During the employment, if a relationship develops which violates the policy, employees must report it to human capital. And that includes if an employee is reassigned in accordance with the policy standards, will be based on a recommendation by the management of the employees organization and approved by the chief human capital. So if along the way a relationship develops as a result of a promotion, the organization will recommend the transfer, who gets transferred out of the organization to the human capital officer, and we will use our normal assignment process for that. Next. And so the regulation will be amended to require that any employee who has, as a result of a hiring, promotion, or transfer an employee would be required to supervise, evaluate, or discipline the family member must immediately report not to exceed 14 calendar days relationship to human capital, and violation of this reporting requirement will subject the supervisor to disciplinary action up to and including termination. So the big changes, of course, is to narrow down the scope of this and really look at where one person has the ability to either promote, discipline, or have an employment action on a family. Pretty straightforward. Any questions, concerns?
Thank you for that. Chief Chechinia, did you have any, start with you, did you have any questions or comments?
I don't have any questions. I'll let others go ahead and start.
Great, thank you. Commissioner McFadden? All right, thank you. Commissioner James?
No, other than just to thank the department for their work and their lens on understanding that there's a balance to, you know, people meet partners in proximity. So understanding that that's a reality, but also protecting that we're not usurping HR rules and regulations and best practices. So appreciate your work, Jerome.
Yeah, this is a little self-preservation. I've had to have some of those difficult conversations, and personally, I couldn't justify why I was making a principal upset with me and also an employee upset with me. When you got both sides upset with you, you probably are not in the best place.
Yes, thank you. And I just had one question. This is really out of me not knowing, sort of like, how does this policy sort of relate to like vendors? So I might not, that we might have a sort of the way that overlaps. If we have someone supervising or bringing in, because we know that schools have, you know, after a certain amount of money, sort of can, you know, they're managing that on their own. So is there any way that we're tracking that as well?
So I think it would fall more into the conflict of interest.
Okay.
Yeah, that would fall more there. So it's specifically outlined in that you can't be a party to contracts that you are related to anyone. So that really falls in that venue.
Great, thank you for that. Yeah.
Mr. Jones, should we specify the contractual piece that you all are just talking about in letter E within the policy standards, or do you think it's general enough to cover that? Should we specify, and this is an honest question, should we specify contractual type of relationships there also? Because you may not directly be an employee of city schools, but you're still doing work with and for city schools. So is that something that you think we need to specify, or is that, does E cover it?
Well, I think that's a great question, but I think I would first have to look at the conflict of interest and what the language is there to see if that really covers it. And maybe we reference, and it may be that we reference, this also applies in those circumstances. So let me look at that and get back to to you on that question.
Great, thank you.
Awesome. And I didn't have any other things. I wonder if other folks have any thoughts. I don't know if we have any. Let me see. Do we have any? And we don't have any public comments either. Do we have any more questions for Mr. Jones? Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And so,
thank you. Have a great evening.
Really appreciate that. And so, with that being said, since we don't have any additional public comments, I would propose that we sort of close this May 18th committee meeting, call it to an end.
Dr. Brooks,
Oh, yep.
Before you wrap up, I'm not trying to hold us at all, but to the staff that's still available, are we able to get an updated matrix of what has been converted from the board rules to where we are currently as far as policy is concerned? And are we able to get an update on that? I know we've gotten it before. Is it necessary for us to have now? It's a question.
Yeah, we can definitely give you an update of the current status of that, Commissioner McFadden.
Yeah, that would just be helpful to see. And, you know, we're in the period of time where we're also planning, you know, for next year and years to come. So it would just be helpful to see that. And also which policies may need to be even updated or amended as a result of things that may have happened or occurred this year. If there is any of that happening, it would be nice.
Like legislative changes, Commissioner McFadden?
Yes, legislative changes. I'm going to think it through a little bit more because I know that we had a conversation similar to this one before. So I just wanted to see how ahead of it we can get and not having to thrust things in just impromptu, not impromptu, but just, it's been a long day, so I'm trying.
Yeah. So I know that the policy committee does monitor legislative changes to make sure that we're reflecting that in policy, and our board calendar development does consider if there's changes that are required by recent events or by legislative changes. And I know they've also been monitoring the pandemic, and if there's anything that's different about the pandemic that has required changes, we've been making those changes. But Joe, I saw it jumped on, who sits on that policy committee and can also, or policy, I forget what we call it, work group, who can also talk about that process.
Hi, everyone. So we received a list of policies that might be impacted by the current legislative season, and we that went through the chiefs and that went through the whole process of the calendar creation. So I have a draft. I'm going to be, I think it's scheduled for July, but I mean, I literally finished it this morning. It's the third iteration, so I think it's pretty ready to go for vetting. So I'll work with Christian to see the best way to get that to you all, and I'm going to be presenting it at PCAB pretty soon, and then presenting it to policy committee. So we definitely have looked at the legislative impact, and then also the other piece that I wanted to hit on is that was a great flag by Commissioner McFadden about the board rules. We're actually preparing to do a presentation at some point over the next year during the policy committee to talk about all of the board rules that still need to be converted, and getting y'all's input on, prioritization of that. So that's something that we're definitely aware of. There are still some that we need to update, but the list is dwindling down compared to what it was a few years ago.
I appreciate that, and I just want us to be mindful of how we do our work, especially in this upcoming year and the year to follow, as we're really focusing on recovery. So that would be helpful to see that information whenever you're going to present it. I'm not going to say sooner than later. I just want us to all be aligned so that we have a shared focus and we're all moving in the same direction for our young people, and we're not overloaded or distracted from the recovery work that we've really got to focus on right now. So that's all. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Brooks. That's it for me.
Thank you. And I would just add for Allison and Joe, sort of while you're doing those board rules, I know that we were also talking about sort of getting out redundancies and then trying to like not be adding on to things. And so really just how getting sort of from your perspective, what are the most pressing things that we need to really be considering in this context, and not just like converting everything just for the purpose of converting, you know, rules into to policy. So to really try to hold that balance. And so we're not overworking you all and then having to do the condensing of the compliance reports. And so all of those things, just to keep that in play as well. So really wanting to lead, let you all lead in that area.
Yeah. No, and we are definitely working on that. And the compliance reports, is, to your point, is part of that, is really making sure we're trying to make them, to consolidate them when possible and make it manageable. We have so many compliance reports right now that it is difficult to make them meaningful. I think there are 80 some, and that is hard, especially sometimes you're getting 4 compliance reports that happened recently from a single department, and there's going to be a limit to how in depth it can be when there's that volume. It's just there. We need to figure out how do we prioritize what we want to know and do it in a way that's really helping us, to your point, inform policy and inform our practice, but in a way that's actually it's possible to develop meaningful reports and not just check the box to get through the many compliance reports that there are right now.
And thank you for that.
Very quickly, to be honest, the way that the board then synthesizes those reports, I think, is also important. So to Dr. Brooks, I'm not sure if we want to think about or consider having compliance report discussions in committee. I think it could be meaningful for us to consider that as we move forward, because there's a lot. When we get the reports, that is in addition to a lot of other information that we have to synthesize. And to your point, Allison, it's a lot of work that goes into them. So we need to take the information seriously, but we also should be mindful and thinking smarter about the way that we use our time and our energy and making sure that the district is moving in the right direction.
Yeah, and sort of Commissioner McFadden, that's sort of coming up that's on our play for the calendar that we're developing. We will be getting compliance reports, and that will be a part of our policy committee meetings sort of as we move into next year. So I also, Joe will also be sort of giving us a presentation on that as well.
Good to know.
Thank you. And yeah, and that was part of the recommendation of Commissioner James. Remember that as sort of an important thread to want to have in the next round. So if, as they would say in the church, all hearts and minds on one accord, would say at 4:47 that we would conclude this meeting. But before we go, I just wanted to let folks know that all of our policy committee meeting and all our committee meetings are open to the public. And we always encourage people to sign up for participation to give public testimony or to engage us in conversation. Our next meeting is scheduled for June 15th. It will be virtual. We'll be covering policy, or rather DJA procurement, our policy calendar, our 21-22 school year, and compliance report reforms. And if folks want to sign up, they can, again, reach out to our executive office, and they will get you connected and put on the schedule for comments for particularly this committee. And you can reach our office at 443-984-2000 or emailing schoolboard@bcps.k12.md.us. And with that being said, I just want to thank you all for coming and appreciate our presenters, and really grateful for all of the work that they do as a district to keep us moving forward. So thank you all so much, and I'll see you later. Bye.